The studio lights blazed overhead as Jimmy Donaldson, better known to millions as MrBeast, settled into the plush leather chair across from host Marcus Shaw. The air felt different tonight. Tense. Electric. Jimmy had done countless interviews before, but something about Shaw's piercing gaze made him uneasy. The usual pre-show banter had been minimal, replaced by an awkward silence that hung heavy in the air. In the wings, Jimmy's team watched nervously, their phones lighting up with messages from fans eager to see their idol on primetime television. The makeup artist had just finished her final touches, dabbing at Jimmy's forehead one last time before scurrying away. The red on-air light blinked to life, and Marcus Shaw's practiced smile appeared. "Tonight," he began, "we're joined by YouTube's biggest star." Little did anyone know, this wouldn't be just another celebrity interview. The first few minutes followed the standard playbook questions about subscriber counts, viral challenges, and philanthropy. Jimmy relaxed slightly, falling into his familiar rhythm of storytelling. He spoke about his latest video, where he'd given away a custom island, complete with its own mansion. The audience laughed at all the right moments, and social media lit up with positive reactions. But then Shaw's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Let's talk about something different," he said, his tone dropping an octave. "You've built an empire by being nice, giving away money, helping people. Some critics say this isn't how successful men should behave." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jimmy's team exchanged worried glances. This wasn't in the pre-interview brief. The YouTube star's easy smile faltered for a split second, but millions watching caught it. Shaw leaned forward, his friendly demeanor morphing into something more predatory. "In a world where traditional masculinity is under attack, you've chosen to build your brand on kindness. Isn't that just performative weakness?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Jimmy sat perfectly still, his mind racing. Years of creating content under pressure had taught him how to think fast. But this was different. This wasn't a challenge video or a carefully scripted segment. This was a direct attack on everything he stood for. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. On social media, the hashtag #MrBeast interview was already trending, with viewers divided between those defending Jimmy and others eagerly awaiting his response. The next few seconds would define the entire narrative. "Interesting question," Jimmy replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Let me ask you something first. What's tougher, following the crowd or choosing your own path?" He leaned forward, matching Shaw's intensity. "I've built something that's never been done before. I've created thousands of jobs, fed millions of people, and changed countless lives. And I did it all while staying true to myself." The audience erupted in spontaneous applause. Shaw tried to interject, but Jimmy wasn't finished. "If you think kindness is weakness, try giving away everything you own. Try working 100-hour weeks to make others happy. Try building something bigger than yourself." His words resonated through the studio like a shockwave. Social media exploded. Clips of the exchange were being shared faster than platforms could track them. "Real masculinity" and "MrBeast responds" shot to the top of trending topics worldwide. In the studio, Shaw's practiced facade cracked slightly. He hadn't expected this level of eloquence, this unwavering conviction. The camera operators zoomed in on both men's faces, capturing every micro-expression in high definition. Jimmy's team was already fielding calls from major news outlets, wanting to cover the story. But the interview wasn't over. Shaw gathered himself, preparing another angle of attack. The battle for defining modern masculinity was playing out on national television, and millions were watching. The next question would change everything. "But isn't this all just an act?" Shaw pressed, gesturing at Jimmy's casual attire. The hoodies, the goofy smile, the endless charity, "It feels manufactured." The accusation was clear, and the studio grew silent. Jimmy's eyes flickered briefly to his team offstage, then back to Shaw. He remembered all the late nights editing, the failed videos, the times he'd sold everything he owned to fund his dreams. He thought about the food banks he'd opened, the houses he'd built, the lives he'd changed. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, not his usual bright grin, but something more knowing. The cameras caught this subtle shift, and viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. The raw authenticity of the moment was undeniable. "Manufactured." Jimmy repeated the word thoughtfully. Let me tell you about manufacturing. He pulled out his phone, opened Twitter, and handed it to Shaw. Scroll through my mentions. Right now, thousands of people are sharing stories about how our videos changed their lives. Kids who started their own businesses, families who escaped poverty, communities that came together. Shaw scrolled, his expression shifting as he read. Every single one of these stories is real. Every smile, every tear, every moment of joy, that's what we manufacture. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the camera operators were transfixed, their usual professional detachment forgotten in the intensity of the moment. The production team in the control room watched their monitors in amazement. Rating numbers were skyrocketing. Major networks were already cutting into their programming to carry the interview live. Shaw's show hadn't seen numbers like this in years. Meanwhile, Jimmy's social media team was documenting an unprecedented surge in engagement. His latest tweet, posted just minutes before the interview, was approaching record-breaking numbers. The narrative was shifting in real time. What had begun as an attempt to undermine MrBeast's image was transforming into something else entirely, a masterclass in authentic leadership. The studio lights seemed to glow brighter, as if responding to the electrical energy in the room. You know what's really tough? Jimmy continued, his voice growing stronger. Walking away from millions in sponsorship deals because they don't align with your values. Building a team that's more like family. Taking risks that everyone calls crazy. He paused, letting the words sink in. I could have taken the easy route, flashy cars, controversy, drama. That's what everyone expected from a YouTuber. Instead, we built something different. The teleprompters were idle now. This had gone far off script. Shaw's producers were frantically discussing in his earpiece, but he seemed unable to regain control of the conversation. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Social media was witnessing its own transformation. The initial divide between critics and supporters was dissolving into a larger conversation about influence and responsibility. Clips of Jimmy's responses were being shared with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like," and "Redefining strength." Even some of his harshest critics were posting thoughtful reconsiderations of their positions. In the studio, Shaw attempted to redirect the conversation back to his prepared talking points, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. The audience was no longer just watching an interview. They were witnessing a cultural moment that would be referenced for years to come. "Let's talk about your latest project," Shaw said, trying to regain control. But Jimmy had spotted something in the audience, a young boy, maybe 12, wearing a Beast philanthropy shirt. Their eyes met, and Jimmy saw in him every subscriber, every dreamer who'd ever watched his videos hoping to make a difference. "Actually," Jimmy interrupted politely, "let's talk about that kid right there." He pointed to the boy, who froze in surprise. "What's your name, buddy?" The boy stood up, trembling slightly. "Michael," he answered. "I started a recycling program at my school because of you." The studio erupted in applause, and Shaw's planned narrative crumbled completely. The interview had transcended its original format. What was meant to be a gotcha moment had transformed into a powerful demonstration of authentic influence. Jimmy stood up, breaking every rule of traditional talk show etiquette, and walked over to Michael. Security shifted nervously, but didn't intervene. "Tell everyone about your recycling program," Jimmy encouraged. As Michael described his initiative, which had spread to 3 neighboring schools, the cameras captured something remarkable. The supposed weak approach to masculinity was inspiring real change in the next generation. Shaw sat in his host chair, watching as his own show transformed into something entirely different right before his eyes. Behind the scenes, network executives were frantically calling the control room. Ratings had broken all previous records for the time slot. Competing networks were already reaching out for rights to rebroadcast clips. Jimmy's team was fielding calls from major newspapers and morning shows, all wanting to book him for follow-up interviews. But in the studio, none of that mattered. Jimmy was fully engaged with Michael, asking about his challenges and offering advice. The audience watched in rapt attention as the world's biggest YouTuber demonstrated exactly why his approach had resonated with millions. This wasn't content creation. This was genuine human connection playing out on national television. Shaw's producer spoke urgently in his earpiece. Wrap it up in 5 minutes. But Shaw found himself hesitating. The story unfolding in his studio was bigger than ratings or schedules. Jimmy was now addressing the entire audience, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. "Everyone here has the power to make a difference," he declared. "It's not about being the toughest or the loudest. It's about being persistent, being genuine, and caring enough to take action." The studio lights caught the tears in Michael's eyes, and across the country, millions of viewers found themselves equally moved. This wasn't just another viral moment, it was a paradigm shift happening in real time. As the interview approached its scheduled end, Shaw attempted one final time to reassert control. "We're almost out of time," he began, but Jimmy held up a hand. "Before we finish," he said, "I have an announcement." The studio held its breath. Jimmy turned to Michael with his characteristic grin. "How would you like $100,000 to expand your recycling program?" The audience erupted. Michael's jaw dropped. Shaw's carefully crafted narrative about masculine toughness lay in shambles, replaced by an undeniable truth. Real strength lies in the ability to lift others up. The red on-air light continued to glow, capturing every second of this unprecedented television moment. The shockwaves from the interview rippled across the media landscape. Morning shows scrambled to rework their segments, desperate to cover what was already being called the MrBeast moment. In New York, Wall Street analysts noted a surge in companies associated with charitable giving. Tech blogs crashed under the weight of traffic as millions sought to rewatch the exchange. Jimmy's phone buzzed continuously with messages from fellow creators, celebrities, and even world leaders, but he wasn't looking at any of them. Instead, he was backstage with Michael and his parents, discussing the logistics of implementing the expanded recycling program. "This isn't just about the money," Jimmy explained, his cameras rolling for a future video. "It's about showing others what's possible." Shaw sat in his dressing room, tie loosened, watching the replay. His producer hovered nervously nearby, already fielding calls from network executives. The interview was tracking to become the most watched segment in the show's history, but that wasn't what occupied Shaw's thoughts. He was replaying the moment when everything shifted, when his attempted takedown transformed into something else entirely. His phone buzzed another message from his teenage son. "Dad, you don't understand what MrBeast means to us." Shaw leaned back in his chair, the weight of realization settling over him. Perhaps he had been asking the wrong questions all along. The real story wasn't about masculinity, it was about evolution. Outside the studio, fans had gathered in unprecedented numbers. The news of Jimmy's impromptu grant to Michael had spread like wildfire, inspiring others to share their own initiatives. Impromptu community meetings were forming in the parking lot, with people exchanging ideas for local projects. Jimmy's team was documenting everything, recognizing that this organic response was more powerful than any planned content could ever be. Chris, Jimmy's longtime friend and collaborator, was already sketching out ideas for a new series, Beast Builders finding and funding grassroots changemakers around the world. The night's events had unleashed something bigger than anyone could have anticipated. In the following hours, the interview clip was translated into dozens of languages, crossing cultural barriers with ease. In Tokyo, a group of students started a midnight brainstorming session for community projects. In Lagos, entrepreneurs began drafting proposals for sustainable business initiatives. In Rio, environmental groups organized spontaneous cleanup drives. The conversation had transcended the original context, becoming a global catalyst for action. Jimmy watched the responses flood in on his phone, surrounded by his team in their hotel suite. "Guys," he said, his voice quiet but determined, "I think we need to think bigger." The team leaned in, recognizing the tone that had preceded their most ambitious projects. The next morning's headlines told the story. MrBeast redefines modern leadership. YouTube star turns interview ambush into triumph. Generation Z finds its voice. But in a small diner across from the studio, Jimmy was having breakfast with Michael and his family, discussing practical steps for implementing the recycling program. He'd brought along his logistics team, the same ones who helped coordinate his massive charitable operations. "The money's just the start," Jimmy explained, sketching ideas on a napkin. "The real challenge is building something sustainable." Michael absorbed every word, Understanding that he was being given more than just funding was being handed a blueprint for creating lasting change. Shaw's network executives called an emergency meeting. Rating numbers had continued to climb as clips of the interview went viral. Competing networks were offering commentary, analysis, and special features. But the real story was happening on social media, where millions of young people were sharing their own stories of impact and change. The demographic that marketers had struggled to reach was fully engaged, discussing everything from environmental initiatives to community building. In the boardroom, executives realized they had witnessed something unprecedented the moment when digital influence transcended traditional media power structures. The old playbook was being rewritten in real time. Jimmy's content team was working overtime, processing footage from multiple angles. The main channel would get a polished version of the interview, but Beast Philanthropy would showcase the real impact: Michael's story, the community response, and the ripple effects already taking shape. Nolan, Jimmy's chief editor, saw something different in the raw footage, moments of genuine emotion that no amount of planning could have produced. "This is why people connect with us," he explained to a new team member. "We don't just show the wins. We show the journey, the challenges, the real human moments that make it all matter." The editing room hummed with energy as they crafted the narrative that would inspire millions more. In Silicon Valley, tech executives were monitoring the unprecedented engagement metrics. The interview had generated more meaningful interaction than any planned campaign in recent memory. Venture capitalists were revising their investment strategies, recognizing that the next generation valued impact over flash. Jimmy's phone lit up with partnership offers, but he forwarded them all to his team with a simple note: "Only if it helps us scale the impact." His focus remained on Michael's project, using it as a prototype for what he called micro-philanthropy, empowering individuals to create change in their own communities. The infrastructure they were building would soon support thousands of similar initiatives. The academic world took notice. Sociology professors adjusted their lesson plans to include discussions of digital influence and social change. Business schools rushed to develop case studies about the interview and its aftermath. Psychology researchers began studying the factors that made Jimmy's approach so effective. But in a high school classroom in Ohio, a teacher simply showed the clip to her students and asked, "What could you do in our community?" The responses filled 3 whiteboards and launched 6 new student-led initiatives. The theoretical was becoming practical, one classroom at a time. The revolution wasn't just being televised, it was being implemented. As the first day drew to a close, Jimmy sat in his hotel room, reading messages from his team. The interview had been viewed more times in 24 hours than any other piece of content they'd ever produced. But it was the responses that mattered most: stories of people taking action, starting projects, making changes in their communities. Chris knocked on the door with pizza and a laptop full of data. "Ready to plan the next phase?" he asked. Jimmy smiled, already envisioning how they could support and scale the movement that had sparked from an attempted ambush interview. The real work was just beginning, and for once, the content would document the change rather than drive it. 1 year after the infamous interview, Jimmy and Shaw met again, not in a television studio, but at the opening of the 1000th Beast Community Center. The building, like hundreds before it, had started as a local initiative inspired by that viral moment. Shaw, who had undergone his own transformation, was there to document the impact for a documentary series titled The Kindness Effect. The 2 men stood in the entrance, watching as Michael, now heading a nationwide student environmental coalition, held a workshop for young entrepreneurs. "I was wrong about strength," Shaw admitted. Cameras rolling. Jimmy just smiled, remembering how an attempt to question his masculinity had instead launched a global movement for positive change. The statistics told one story: over $10 million invested in grassroots projects, 50,000 local initiatives launched, and a measurable reduction in carbon emissions from community-led environmental programs. But the real story could be found in countless small moments: a teenager in Malaysia starting a food distribution program, a retired teacher in Brazil creating a literacy network, a group of kids in Kenya developing solar-powered water filters. The interview that was meant to tear down had instead built up, creating a template for turning social media influence into tangible impact. Jimmy's team had documented it all, creating an open-source playbook for community transformation that was being taught in schools worldwide. On the second anniversary of the interview, Jimmy released a special video. It opened with a confrontational moment from Shaw's show but expanded to tell the stories of thousands who had turned inspiration into action. The final scene showed him back in that same studio, but this time the seats were filled with project leaders from around the world, including Michael, who had just won a national environmental award. "Strength isn't about proving others wrong," Jimmy concluded, looking directly into the camera. "It's about proving what's possible when we believe in each other." As the video ended, millions of viewers worldwide opened their browsers, not to watch another video, but to start their own projects. The revolution that began with an attempted takedown had become a permanent revolution of kindness, proving once and for all that the most powerful form of masculinity and humanity is the kind that lifts others up. The end of this story marked not just the conclusion of a viral moment, but the beginning of a lasting movement that would continue to shape how future generations understood influence, impact, and the true meaning of strength.